Picture this scenario. Imagine you have been tasked with running a Pathfinder 2e game, probably a one-shot or a short campaign of under 6 sessions, and you have a short notice time frame to prep at least the first session of it. You might know the people you're playing with. It might be your siblings, it might be some friends, it might be your friends and their kids, or it might be a group of random strangers that you have never met before. Either way, you have probably around 2 to 3 hours to build a one-shot that you can run for a group of mostly new players. Today I'm going to be talking about how you can minimize your stress as you're doing this and avoid over-prepping. I'm targeting this more at people who are more like me in that you're a chronic over-prepper, because I am very, very bad about that, and my inclination is to write pages upon pages upon pages of notes, not to limit it to the scale of what I'm actually running. This is a tactic I use to minimize it. A lot of this video is based on a longer video, which is about 1 hour in length, and will be linked in the description, by Jason Bullman, one of the co-designers of Pathfinder 2e, about how he builds one-shots. The tactics in this video are specifically tailored for D20 systems with a focus on Pathfinder, but you could probably make use of them for any similar system, like for instance D&D. My name is Sidwin, and let's get started here. So what I have up on the screen here is a one-shot that I prepped, my very first one-shot that I prepped for Pathfinder 2e, and it's probably my first time using this prep method. I'm doing this because it's essentially showing what you might end up with your first time. The page is a little bit messy because I made it in a vector graphics program, and you might notice all of the notes are on a single page of paper, including a map. And you might also notice something about the map. It's only got about 5 rooms. Like, yeah, you could technically argue that a couple of these would make it closer to 7 or 8, in that that's how I numbered it. But in reality, if you're looking at how players are going to explore the dungeon, you have the cave at the entrance, that's 1. Then you have the bandit chambers, which are 2 and 3. You would count that as more of a room 2 than technically 2 different rooms. Then you have room 3, which would be marked area 6. Room 4 would be marked area 7 and 8. And room 5 would be area 4. This is the 5-room dungeon prep method for one-shots, which is covered in that Jason Bullman video and discussed in many other locations. Basically, the idea is you confine your dungeon to 5 rooms, and you have 1 boss or major antagonist fight and a couple of smaller fights spread throughout. You could also toss in some traps. In this particular case, I had a slightly longer thing outside of it, but I improvised that because I realized I had more time than I thought I did. It's always easier to add than it is to take away when you're doing a dungeon, though. So it's better to stick to the smaller number of rooms when you're in the scenario of a quick prep. So now I'll talk a bit about how I went about doing this method. You might notice I have no stat blocks on this page. That's because I pulled it up for the specific system I was running. So for Pathfinder, I went to Archives of Nethys and found the generic stat blocks for the bandits and a low-level demon, which is mentioned down here at the bottom, and that's the only combat encounters in this place. I also decided to make this off a gimmick. Basically, there's a couple of ways you can go about this, in that you want one focal point for your adventure, and it can determine how the adventure is structured. So you might structure it around one major antagonist. Maybe your players are going to fight a goblin chief. So you structure everything about the goblin chief and his goblin soldiers. Or you might decide to center it around a location. Maybe players are tasked with exploring an ancient tomb, and you would structure it around the different things that you would find in such a tomb. Or you might do what I did in this case, which is structure it around an item. One-shots and short campaigns are a perfect time to play with items that you would not want in your main campaigns. Like, for instance, in this case, I did what would be called an artifact in D&D. So if you've ever seen the D&D artifacts book from 2nd edition or 3rd edition, you'll know what I'm talking about. These are basically very powerful items that are kind of cursed. So it's a good basis for a one-shot in that you will not have everything ruined by your players finding it. Artifacts kind of require having a game structured around them, and not just things you come across and find. So what I did in this case was I based it off the Quill of Korath from D&D 2e, and made it so that it's a quill that when you write something with it, it invokes a wish spell. A spoiler for this particular adventure, in case you're going to try and replicate this, is the problem with that quill is it can't actually create anything. It just brings something else to you. So for instance, if the player would take it and write, "I want the most powerful sword in the world," they would get a very, very powerful sword that would seem newly created, but in reality, it was taken from a random level 20 adventurer. So that's the basis. The idea was to offer an option to extend into a longer campaign if that would be desired. But if it wasn't going to extend into a longer campaign, I wouldn't have it ruining my main campaign. So now that I've talked a bit about that basis, I'll talk about how you can go about this. So if you're going for a item structured adventure, you should find or make the item. That is priority number 1, because then if it's a very powerful item, you can structure the dungeon around it. So in this case, I had the quill, and I knew that I wanted the quill to have been created by a mage long ago, and for it to be bound with the soul of a demon. So I knew I was going to be creating a dungeon structured around the quill and the demon attached to it, with the elven mage guarding it. So in this layout, I had room 6 be the study of the mage, because it was used for that long ago. Then I had this area, 7 and 8, be the place where the quill and the mage and the demon are locked. The idea being that the elven mage didn't want anyone else to access this. Then I had a couple of other rooms in here that were assumedly used for like libraries or something else in the past. But because this quill had been locked away for so long, obviously it would have fallen into disrepair. So that's how I got my first encounter. Because what goes into a space that's abandoned and in the middle of nowhere? So I could have taken goblins or some other low-level monster, but I went with bandits, so that there would be a hoard of treasure here for the players to find. You could also do it with goblins, but that's basically the structure. So you take the item, find things which relate to it, like if there's a creator or a former possessor, and then you construct the dungeon based off what those people would have been using. And you always have the option, if it's an item, to have that area fallen into disrepair, so you can just use a generic low-level enemy. With a short time frame, you don't generally want to be building monsters in a lot of systems, but if you had a bit of extra time, you could choose to build a custom monster using monster building rules. That'll depend on your system, but for Pathfinder, it's pretty easy. Now I'll talk about how you could have done the same thing if you were instead doing a monster-focused adventure. So here I actually have a web browser open, so I'm just going to go to Archives of Nessus and pull open creatures, and then I'm going to filter it to level 2 critters, with the idea being that this is a one-shot for a new player. And then you can go through and see, hey, do any of these look interesting as a monster that your players would be centering the dungeon around. So in this case, let's just say that I'm going to take the giant toad here. So what it says here is giant toads are large animals, so it's big enough to swallow a player, and they're found in the desert. So if you're structuring a one-shot based off this, you know that it'll probably be in a desert environment. So from there, you can interpret, okay, what other things might appear in the desert. You could think maybe jackals or bandits or something else traveling it. Then, why is the toad a problem? So I'm using the structure here of essentially who, what, where, why, and how. So the who is the giant toad and the various other things wandering around in the desert. The what is the giant toad doing to cause a problem? So he could be eating camel caravans or otherwise provoking the local rulers. Where is the desert? Because that's where the giant toad lives and is causing problems. Who, what, where, why is the toad attacking? That would just be the toad's eating people and it's hungry. And then how for the adventure is how are you going to introduce it to the players, I guess. So for that, you would just have some entity hire them to go hunt the toad. The toad's not intelligent, so it can't really be an active provocateur, but that is just a quick way to structure it. And this would also somewhat remove the 5-room dungeon format, because usually toads aren't in a dungeon, unless you reinterpret the dungeon a bit. Because you can use the same sort of format with, say, the toad being in a ravine, which would be one of the rooms. Then the players would have to cross the desert, which would be a second room. And you could also have a cave in that ravine where the toad is actually sitting. So that could be a 3-room dungeon with 2 encounters. You could have one in the desert before they get there, and one with the actual toad. And that would actually be enough to just run an adventure. You just have to find what the other encounter would be. So if I was doing that, and since the giant toad is only suitable for a level 1 one-shot, I'm going to want to look for an easier encounter. So I'm going to set the maximum level to 1 and the minimum level to whatever the lowest is. And you would just look for something that would appear in a desert. Generally, you can always go with the easy ones, like for instance, you could grab the goblins, which I know will be in this list, or maybe you could do a group of cultists, thinking the toad is an entity of power to be following. And that would give you a short one-shot you could just run for your group without much difficulty. Now I've tabbed back over to the adventure. And at this point, I've talked about how you do a monster-based adventure and an item-based adventure. And the third type would be a place. So I don't generally run place-based adventures. I prefer to focus on some inciting incident. But if you're doing a place-based adventure, you basically construct it similarly to the item without having the item to base it around. So I'll go with the ancient tomb example. You might notice I'm not drawing anything out here, but that's just because I'm not actually prepping these, because that'll take a bit more time. So for the ancient tomb, you're going with the 5-room layout. For a easy layout from that, you could just take a ancient Egyptian tomb. So in that case, you would have the stairway down in, you would have the antechamber with the treasure inside, you would have the burial chamber with the coffin inside, and you would have 2 additional rooms off to the side of each of those. One is beside the antechamber, which is a sub-antechamber, and in the burial chamber, you would have a little side chamber with some treasure in it. So that layout is actually pretty much just ripping off King Tutankhamun's tomb. You would just make it slightly bigger, because in general, having rooms that are about 5 feet wide is not fun if players can move 30 feet, and technically you can only really have 1 combatant in 1 square. That's if you're using a battle map, though, and you might not be. So with that, since it's an ancient tomb and you want your players to be exploring it, you of course need to include some things that'll appear in ancient tombs. So, who is in the tomb? Here, the most obvious one would just be mummy. Now, you can tailor this somewhat based off what level your players are, because as you can see, if you just go to traits and find the mummy trait going across all the different levels. There's 15 different results ranging from level 2 to level 17. So if you're doing a level 1 adventure, you could do a decrepit mummy, which is easier to fight. But if you're doing a higher level one, you could use a cursed king or anything else. And in here, if you're doing the mummy, you can also see a lower level encounter derived from it. So I'll talk about, with that 5-room layout, how you could build 2 encounters for 2 different levels using just these enemies. So let's start with the low level example, where the main enemy is the decrepit mummy, and your players are trying to steal something. Because, I mean, they're tomb raiders. That's what you would be doing if you're doing the ancient tomb. So then, some things you could decide to choose what's in the tomb is who was the decrepit mummy in life. Like, for instance, was it a great king? Was it a child prince? Was it a powerful wizard, etc.? It's just, you would justify anything by saying it's too decayed to actually do that now, so it's just a weak mummy. Then, for a second encounter off this list, you could choose to do a couple of mummified cats, which could let you imply, hey, maybe the decrepit mummy liked cats. And then you could have a couple of other cat-based items in the chamber. And usually players like getting shiny stuff, so you want like 1 or 2 shiny rewards at the end. And you could make that an amulet or a cool sword, depending on who the mummy was. And generally, to prep that, you would just read through the stat blocks, get somewhat familiar with them, and then draw out a quick 5-room dungeon. Or, if you are really pressed for time, in this case, you can totally just take a map of King Tutankhamun's tomb, erase everything, and draw in new squares that make it bigger. Just depends on the amount of time you have. Then, if you're going to prep for a higher level, let's say that your players are going to be level 8 or 7 or 8, you could go with the Cursed King. So in this case, it's more complex stat block, meaning that you're going to have to read a bit more. And the Cursed King's minions, since players are level 7 or 8, you want a level 6 or so enemy, so you can go with the Mummy Guardian. That is one convenient thing about Pathfinder, in that generally for every time you have a more powerful monster, they built a couple of minions that go along with it. So you would basically just do the same thing you would do for lower level. And there you have your hack and slash tomb adventure. Those are the shortcut ways you can quickly prep an adventure, and you could transfer this to D&D 5e or D&D 3.5. I'm just not using the examples because I don't have the books here, and I don't own the games on their websites, so I can't really just view them. But I hope that was helpful in explaining how you can quickly get an adventure put together to use for your players in Pathfinder 2e. I do highly recommend you watch that video by Jason Bullman I previously recommended. As a reminder, it is linked in the description. Thank you for watching.